Hello, and welcome back to my reaction to the documentary Murder in Paradise. This video is part 8, and it simply provides some background information relevant to the trial of Zaw Lin and Wai Pyo before I return to viewing and commenting on the final 13 minutes of the documentary. In the closing stages of the documentary, which focus on the trial of Zaw Lin and Wai Pyo, it is quite clear that the director and his crew are out of their depth and undertook insufficient research to adequately inform their audience back in Britain. In relation to the trial, they interviewed the wrong people on camera, they asked the wrong questions, they made incorrect assumptions, they failed to make some crucial observations. It appears that they did not understand what was happening. In the introduction to part 1 of my YouTube reaction videos, I described the documentary as, quote, ambitious, unquote, because it was only 47 minutes short, yet claimed that this is the inside story of Murder in Paradise. In reality, it could not hope to even scratch the surface of what happened at the trial in the few short minutes assigned to that event. Most British nationals would have a limited understanding of Thai culture and how the criminal justice system operates in the kingdom. I imagine that most of the British viewers would have been left confused after watching the segment about the trial. If the director did not understand what was happening and allotted only a few minutes to covering the trial, it is hardly surprising if his audience was left confused. Before starting a brief discussion of the trial, I wish you to have some terms at the top of your mind, namely fraud, scientific fraud, and expert evidence. For just over a minute, you have been looking at a picture of Leonardo DiCaprio playing the part of Frank Abagnale Jr. in the 2002 movie Catch Me If You Can. People familiar with the movie would be aware that the former conman Frank Abagnale successfully impersonated a Pan Am pilot and, amongst other things, was able to cash huge volumes of dud checks when cloaked in the respectability of a pilot's uniform. In a later part of this series of videos, I will refer to a dud unendorsed report that actually came from an unaccredited police laboratory, and that dud report, was used to convict the defendants. I'll now show you the real Frank Abagnale, filmed in recent years, who went on to work for the FBI for just over 4 decades, and 30 seconds from one of his talks where he discusses the power of the uniform.
In hotels around the world for free, all I saw was a uniform and said to myself, if I had that uniform on and I walked in a bank, it would be a lot easier to cash a check than me walking in as just some young kid. So the whole thing was to get a uniform and do that. But then I quickly realized the power of that uniform, how it turned from night to day. No one ever said no when I walked in to cash a check, even though there was no bank account there or anything else. All they saw was the uniform. They didn't see me. And I realized very early on the power of that uniform. And then I realized I had gone to the TWA ticket counter, just like he showed in the movie.
That's enough to make the point there. There is a power in the uniform, there's a power in appearances, and often too there can be power in words such as DNA, or the acronym DNA, or the word forensic. People suddenly think, after having watched lots of TV programs about DNA and forensics, that as soon as someone simply utters those words, that there's some magical evidence that is extraordinarily compelling. But often that's not actually the case. I will include a link to that particular YouTube video in the comments below. That is the video with Frank Abagnale Jr. A recurring theme in relation to many aspects of the trial and of life in Thailand is that appearances are often extremely deceptive. Thai people often place huge importance on appearances, such as wearing a smart suit or a smart uniform, but often place relatively little importance on actually being competent, conscientious, or diligent in performing their duties. There are many types of scams in Thailand, many types of frauds in Thailand. Many travel bloggers and travel vloggers focus on gem scams, or they'll focus on taxi scams or jet ski scams, and then there are the massive real estate scams. However, the biggest scams in Thailand relate to modern-day slavery, human trafficking, and murder. The cover-ups of the murders of tourists to protect the lucrative tourism industry are very common. One of my messages is, don't be gullible when listening to what the Thai police said about the murders of Hannah and David. Unfortunately, and with respect to the defense lawyers, they made some serious mistakes in the conduct of the defense. And with the greatest respect to the judges, they also made some significant mistakes. In addition, the Thai and international mainstream media largely failed to cover the story adequately. This is a good time to mention how I came to take an interest in the trial. I'm a solicitor and have owned a legal practice in Perth, Western Australia for over 20 years. In the course of my practice, I have often successfully investigated frauds against investors and frauds against deceased estates, and proved those frauds in courts and to various regulatory bodies. The human rights activist Andy Hall is featured in the documentary. I first learned about Andy on about the 2nd of September 2014 when I read an article in the West Australian, which is the local paper here in Perth, and that article referred to civil and criminal defamation actions brought against Andy by the Natural Fruit Company of Thailand. Those actions arose from a report by a Finnish NGO, Finwatch, with the title, quote, "Cheap has a high price," unquote. Andy Hall conducted much of the research about alleged migrant worker exploitation for that report. Like most Westerners, I place a high premium on freedom of speech, and therefore I thought the actions against Andy Hall were outrageous. I telephoned him within about 24 hours of reading the article and started providing some financial support and other practical support to him as he defended himself from the Natural Fruit Company. Given that Australia is a major trading partner of Thailand, I decided, with Andy's knowledge and blessing, to write to all our federal members of Parliament and senators in Canberra, requesting that representations be made to the Thai government in the hope that Andy would receive fair trials. To my dismay, as my letters were arriving in Canberra, Andy decided to publicly criticise the Australian government on social media over its plan to send some refugees to Cambodia. I actually agreed with Andy's humanitarian position, but I thought it highly counterproductive for Andy to seek support from the Australian government while publicly attacking it. I did point out to Andy that his actions could undermine my attempts to secure some support for him, but he was dismissive of my concerns and made a similar public comment a few weeks later. I had read some glowing reports about Andy Hall in the British media and noted that he had a law degree with first-class honours from the prestigious University College London, which was all very impressive. Much later, one British journalist told me he had some reservation about Andy's sometimes unusual behaviour, but there was no hint of those reservations in the journalist's reports. Sometimes a half-truth can be just as misleading as an outright lie. Within a fortnight of first making contact with Andy, Hannah and David had been murdered on Koh Tao, and Andy started to take a keen interest in those murders and the arrest of Zorlin and Waipio. Andy and I had agreed that I should travel to Bangkok to be present with him when judgment was handed down in the Prakanong Provincial Court in his first criminal defamation case on the 29th of October 2014. I flew up to Bangkok from Perth, and later Andy flew up from Koh Samui, where he had been visiting both Zorlin and Waipio in the Samui prison. I noted during our first meeting on the 28th of October 2014 that Andy was easily distracted by pictures on his mobile phone and by the hotel's small shampoo bottles. He requested and received some extra shampoo bottles, which appeared to be more important to him than discussing his various legal problems. One thing that became quite apparent to me at that first meeting is that Andy had little knowledge of the law of evidence. This puzzled me, as I understand that in most Australian law schools, evidence is a compulsory subject. At the University of Western Australia, where I obtained my bachelor's degree, evidence is a second-year subject in a 4-year degree. Later I learned that evidence is not a compulsory subject at University College London Law School, where a bachelor's degree involves just 3 years of full-time study. In the documentary, Andy Hall is simply described as a migrant rights campaigner, which is an appropriate description. Although his own website states that he has a law degree with first-class honours from UCL, he has always maintained that he is not a lawyer. In the circumstances, Andy was not the person to interview regarding the DNA evidence, although obviously it was kind of him to make himself available to be interviewed. It would have been far better had the crew interviewed the Australian DNA collection expert Jane Taupin, who had travelled to Koh Tao to give evidence but was not called by the defence in an apparent error of judgment. And this is what Jane looks like. She's there on the far right. This is a photograph from the BBC. That's Andy Hall in the middle, and Jonathan Head of the BBC is on the far left. I also met up with Andy Hall on 29th of October 2014 at the Prakanong Court, and on the 30th of October 2014 at the Nakhon Pathom Court. And here is a picture of a group of us during a lunch break. I am there at the very back, just behind Andy. There are a couple of Burmese men, and there are 2 Thai lawyers off on the right there. The fellow next to the wall is Nakhon, who was the head lawyer, or he was often described as the head lawyer for the defence team. I also met up with Andy in July 2015, where we observed our mutual friends Alan Morrison and Chutama Siddhasathian, both journalists, as we watched them successfully defend a criminal defamation action brought by the Royal Thai Navy. Later in July 2015, Andy asked me to put him in touch with Jane Taupin after she was recommended to him by a Melbourne Queen's Counsel, which I did. I shall discuss Jane Taupin in a later part of this series, but will include a link to an article published in the Sydney Morning Herald and in the Melbourne Age, dated the 7th of January 2016, in which she is interviewed. Before closing this particular part, I'll just show you a couple more pictures. This gives a bit more background as to what was happening inside the courtroom. At times the lead prosecutor, there were 2 prosecutors present, at times he was dozing. This was typically during the defence giving evidence, and one can read into that whatever one wishes to. Of slightly more concern is this image here. There were 3 judges who heard the case. There was a lead judge or head judge who was male. There was an older female judge who was often asleep, and there was a younger female judge who left the room from time to time, who left the courtroom while evidence was being heard. Now, it's actually not uncommon for Thai judges to leave a room while the evidence, or leave a courtroom while the evidence is being heard, so long as there's at least one left behind. But there are no verbatim records, which means that it just really makes it much more difficult for that judge to make a considered judgment himself or herself about the guilt or otherwise of the defendants. Okay, I'll leave it for there for now. If you've enjoyed or found this at all informative, please press like, and please share with your friends on social media. And in the meantime, please stay safe. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.